Let's bow in a word of prayer. Heavenly gracious Father, we thank you so much for tonight. I just pray that you be with us to guide and direct us. Lord, help me to share your truth, the truth that you have placed upon my heart and through my study. Lord, may everything I say be words that are not misleading or untruthful, but only be your divine truth. Lord, I pray this in Jesus' name. Amen. So, we're going to be talking about the Middle East conflict tonight. And what I wanted to do was, and I've talked to you about this from time to time, but what I wanted to do to begin with is I wanted to look at the real beginning of this conflict, which it actually started thousands of years ago. And it started with Abraham and his two sons. So we're going to get into that right now. This is what is written in Genesis. Moses wrote Genesis. This is what it says in Genesis chapter 12, verses 1 through 3. It says, "The Lord said to Abraham, go from your land, your relatives, and your father's house to the land that I will show you. I will make you into a great nation. I will bless you. I will make your name great, and you will be a blessing. And I will bless those who bless you. I will curse anyone who treats you with contempt. And all the peoples on the earth will be blessed through you." By the way, that quote that you hear a lot about, God blesses those who bless Israel, that's really this passage. It's really written for Abraham's descendants, and specifically for the descendants from Isaac to Jacob. Jacob, who is also known as Israel. Israel means the one who wrestles with God. He's given that name after his encounter with God in Bethel, and they wrestle all night long. And if anyone says, well, it's not biblical that God blesses those who bless Israel. No, it actually comes right here from Genesis chapter 12, verse 3. So the beginning, Abraham has two sons. He has one son that was created by the flesh when Sarah says, hey, you know what? I'm never going to have a child. I'm 80 plus years old at this point. If God is going to give you the blessings that he says, take my maidservant Hagar and sleep with her. And the result of that is the son Ishmael. And then later, there's the son Isaac, who is born through the Spirit when God says, no, Sarah will become pregnant and Sarah will give you a son, and you will name him Isaac. We have the story of two brothers. Ishmael becomes the father of the Arab nations. He's also one of the highest prophets in the Quran. The Muslim faith considers him one of the great prophets. So Ishmael becomes a great leader of the Arab people, and eventually the Muslim faith. Again, the Muslim faith didn't start till after some 300 years after Christ's death. Muslim faith wasn't around when Ishmael was around, or even when Jesus was around. It was created much later. They consider Ishmael to be a prophet. So here's what it says about Ishmael. It said, an angel of the Lord said to her, and again, now what's happened now is after Sarah had given, at this point her name is Sarai, but after Sarah had given Hagar to Abraham, she begins to treat her master, Sarah, badly because she goes, oh, I'm the one who's pregnant. I'm the one who's going to give him a child. And so she starts to mistreat Sarah. And so Sarah begins to mistreat her. And eventually Hagar runs off. And this is the Lord going and speaking to her. And an angel of the Lord said to her, you have conceived and will have a son. You will name him Ishmael, for the Lord has heard your cry of affliction. This man will be like a wild donkey. His hand will be against everyone, and everyone's hand will be against him. He will settle near all his relatives. So this is speaking of the fact that he's going to be the father of the Arab nations, and we're going to get another passage in a little bit that talks about that. Abraham said to God, if Ishmael were acceptable to you. So God now says, okay, I'm going to give you a son. And Abraham's first plea is like, hey, take my son Ishmael. Make him the chosen one. And God says, no. No, your wife Sarah will bear you a son, and you will name him Isaac. I will confirm a covenant with him as a permanent covenant for his future offspring. As for Ishmael, I have heard you, and I will certainly bless him. I will make him fruitful and multiply him greatly. He will be the father of 12 tribal leaders, and I will make him into a great nation, the Arab nations. But I will confirm my covenant with Isaac, whom Sarah will bear to you at this time next year. Now, it's interesting because, again, they're both in their 90s now, and God waited until it would be impossible for man to have a child at that point. It would be impossible in human nature for someone to have a child in this situation. but God waited so that it was only through God that Isaac could be born. Now, it's interesting, as I shared with you, in the Quran, Ishmael is the chosen one. And when Isaac is sacrificed on Mount Moriah is the mountain on which Jerusalem was built. It is the mountain, and its peak is where the Dome of the Rock is now, and where originally the temple of God was. They tell you, although the Quran says that his son, it doesn't name a name, but the Islamic Muslim tradition is that it was not Isaac that was taken to be sacrificed on Mount Moriah, but it was instead Ishmael. And they have a couple different explanations, very different than what the Bible says. The Bible says that when he went to kill him, that God said stop, or an angel of the Lord said stop, and then he provided for him a goat or a lamb to replace Isaac, and that's what they sacrificed that day. And then God says, because you were willing to sacrifice your son, I know that you are worthy of the promises I've given you and stuff. And so it's really a test of Abraham's faith, because Abraham believed even if he killed his son, somehow God was going to raise Isaac from the dead. So he believed no matter what happened that day, that Isaac was still going to be what God had called him to be, because he truly wholeheartedly believed and had faith in God. And so this is the beginning of that conflict. You have Ishmael, who was the son of the slave, and you have Isaac, who was the son of the wife Sarah, and they become enemies. In fact, they become the rationalization for what has been a war between the Jews and the Arabs ever since. One finds its ancestry going all the way back to Ishmael. One finds its ancestry going all the way back to Isaac. And so that conflict starts right there. And that's important for us to understand. And as I was doing research and reading this week, it kind of bothered me that Christian writers didn't want to go that far back. They're like, well, we don't want to do that, because they want to give you a modern narrative so that they can twist your understanding of situations. But the reality is it really begins all the way back when Abraham chose to not be obedient originally and sleep with Hagar, have a child, and not wait for God's provision. And so that is the conflict between those two brothers that continues today. So you have the one son, Ishmael, who was born to Hagar. You have the second son, Isaac, who was born from Abraham and Sarah. This is what it says in Genesis 21:8-11. The child grew and was weaned. Abraham held a great feast on the day Isaac was weaned, but Sarah saw the son, being Ishmael, mocking the one Hagar the Egyptian had borne to Abraham. So she said to Abraham, drive out this slave with her son, for the son of this slave will not be a co-heir with my son Isaac. And that's what happens. Abraham sends her away that day. And then God then finds them again when they're about to starve to death and says, again, I promise you, you will be a great nation, a nation of Arabs. And this is what it says in Galatians chapter 4. Paul kind of summarizes this to also understand faith. He says, now you too, brothers and sisters, like Isaac, are children of promise. But just as then the child born as a result of the flesh persecuted the one born as a result of the Spirit, so also now. But what does the Scripture say? And this is what Sarah has said. Drive out the slave and her son, for the son of the slave will never be a co-heir with the son of the free woman. Therefore, brothers and sisters, we are not children of a slave, but of the free woman. And that's just talking about faith and stuff, but it also drives home what was understood. The Jews understood that Ishmael was the one driven out. He was the one who becomes the father of the Arab nations. He was the one who, from that point forward, is at war with the nation of Israel and with Isaac and his descendants, because he thought it was his birthright. Well, that's really where this conflict originally begins, right there in the very beginning of the Bible. So Isaac is the father of the nation of Israel, and Ishmael becomes the father of the Arab nations. He's also seen as a prophet, and as I shared with you. Oh, I didn't explain to you. So when Muslim tradition, Islamic tradition, they teach that when Abraham went to sacrifice Ishmael, that there was a copper plate over his chest. But somehow that Abraham actually did it, but because there was a piece of metal or something covering him, he couldn't complete the task. The reality is this: the book of Quran, but they take Isaac and replace him with Ishmael and things like that. Muhammad, he was very impressed with the Jewish nation and how they stuck together and how they were organized and how they were obedient. So he wanted to create his own religion. Again, Muhammad was a spice salesman. He was a trader, and he ran into the Jews a lot, and he was impressed with how they lived because of their faith. And so what he does is he begins to write his own Bible. So that's where the Quran comes from. All right, moving forward. Take your son, he said, your only son Isaac, whom you love, and go to Moriah, Mount Moriah, and offer him there. Again, that's where the temple of the Lord was, and now the Dome of the Rock is. And offer him there as a burnt offering on one of the mountains, and I will tell you about it. All right, so that's kind of a brief telling of the history of the conflict that's 5,000 years old. And it's been going on ever since. But now let's look at a brief history of the occupied land. So we know that in 725, Israel is captured. In 500, I don't have my numbers in front of me right now, Babylon captures Judea, the southern kingdom, and all of Israel, all the nation of both Israel, Samaria, and Judah have all been captured by foreign territories. And they continue to be that way after that. But they are able to come back and reestablish their land and their name. They never lose the name Israel for the longest period of time. But I want to go beyond those captivities into the Roman captivity period. And during this period, we know that, and we've read this, and when we read the New Testament, that there was Galilee, there was Samaria, and there was Judea, but they were controlled by the Romans, but also controlled by the Israelis. They were able to keep their own king. They had their own religious system, their own religious lawyers, and things like that. So they were basically still allowed to oversee themselves, even though they were occupied by Rome. Things began to change in 70 AD. In 70 AD, the revolts by the Jews become so great that the armies of Rome come in and destroy the temple and drive many of the Jews out of Jerusalem into Masada. And eventually those people at Masada die. Things calm down. Things were going pretty good. The people of Israel kind of calmed down a little bit. And then in 132 through 135 AD, revolts start to happen again, and this time Rome says, we're done with this. And so they go in and completely destroy the city of Jerusalem, which is the capital of the nation of Israel. They completely destroy it, and from that point forward, they change the name of Israel to Palestine. Now, why did they choose Palestine? I've always thought this. I actually was watching something with Deb earlier, and they said this, and I'm like, oh, well, maybe I'm right about that. But it sounds like Philistines, which is the most hated enemy of the Jews. And so I think it was a play on that as almost a spite at the Jews, that the land that is their land is now going to be called something you despise. And Palestine was never a word. Palestine was never a nation. In fact, once Rome takes over and destroys Jerusalem, Palestine at that point is not a nation. All the time up to 132 to 135 AD, Israel remained a nation where there was always some inhabitants, always a remnant who were in control or who were in Israel and living there. And so that during that whole period of time, it remained Israel. For over 2,000 years, it remained Israel. And then from 132 through 35, they're wiped out. They changed the name to Palestine, and everything changes from that point forward. At around 300 AD, the Byzantines take over. That is the eastern part of the Roman Empire. The Roman Empire starts to fade. The Caesar at that time is Constantine, and he's actually a Byzantine, and he moves the capitals and everything away from Rome, and he moves them to Constantinople and becomes an Eastern religion. So that's why we have today the Western Orthodox, Catholic, Protestant faith, and we have the Eastern Orthodox, where you have the Russian Orthodox, you have the Greek Orthodox, and you just have Eastern Orthodox. And so that was that split that happened, that chasm that happened. So from 300 AD on, the Byzantines control Jerusalem, control the nation of Israel or Palestine. During that period of time, they built tremendous amount of churches throughout the land of Israel. In fact, many of the most ancient churches left in Israel are the Church of the Nativity was a Byzantine church. There is wreckage of other Byzantine churches throughout Israel. When the Byzantines take over, they turn it into a place to go as a great holy land. And that's what goes on during that period of time. In 638 AD is the first Muslim caliph. And during that point of time, the nation of Israel or the nation of Palestine is taken over and moved out. And so they start to control from 638 AD. Then the Crusaders come in around 1099 AD, and they take control of Jerusalem. They take control of Israel for a short period of time until Syria, and I don't really have a date on Syria, but for a very, very short period of time, Syria takes control of Israel or Palestine. And then ultimately the Ottoman Empire takes over and they rule for nearly 1,000 years. They rule over the area of Jerusalem and Palestine. Then in 1917, after World War I, when the Ottoman Empire, along with Germany and the other power in that First World War, are defeated, they split up the territory like they did after World War II, split up the eastern part of Europe. They split up the Middle East and gave it to different nations and stuff. And so Britain took the mandate over Israel or Palestine, and they took control of it in 1917. It was at that time in 1917 that they made an agreement that they said, hey, we're going to make this a Jewish state. We're going to make this a place where the Jewish people can come and have a homeland and reestablish their lives. So they originally in 1917 have the intent to allow the people of Israel back into Palestine or Israel as we know it. Now, the interesting thing during that point, and I'm going to get to that in a little bit in my some other notes I have here, but from about 1850 on, the Jews had slowly started moving back into Israel. They had started to take over areas of Israel that were desolate. Now, you got to understand something. From the destruction of Jerusalem on down, I mean, the Byzantine period was nice, but from 638 all the way down to 1900s, the nation of Israel was barren land. It was desolate. There was no real great cities. There was no real great anything. It was the Ottomans and some of the other Muslims did everything in their power to destroy the land because they despised the Jews so much. And so they had pretty much destroyed the land. Nobody was living there. The only thing you would have was nomadic shepherds who would come through the land, so on and so forth. But in about 1850, the Jews began to go back into Palestine and begin to repopulate it. And they start to take up areas of land and they cultivate the land and they bring it back to life. In fact, there had not been good life in the land ever since Israel had been kicked out, ever since the Jews had been kicked out. Now in the 1850s, they come back, they start to revive the land, make it vigorous again. And what ends up happening, the interesting and the ironic thing about what happens is this land that no one really wanted to live in, after the Jews started to bring it back to life, now the Arabs wanted to come back in again. And so you had a mix of Arabs and Jews living in the land. And the Arabs came back in because now they saw it as fruitful land because of what the Jews started doing in the 1850s. So that being said, when the mandate is made in 1917, you have a mixture of Christians, Arabs, and Jews living in Palestine. But the British people said, we're going to let the Jews come back in. And during that period of time, when the Jews started coming back in, we start seeing the skirmishes that will continue to this day. Year after year, there is always skirmishes between the Arabs and the Israelis, the Jews. And that's what we continue to see. So the return, we'll start talking about. So in the 1850s, as I said, the Jews started to return to the land of Israel. 1897 was the first time there was a call for a Jewish state in Palestine, as they had populated and made it a much better place to live again. Again, obviously, the Arabs were very much against this at this point. In 1917, after taking control, they declared Palestine would become the home for the Jews. In World War II, Great Britain denies the Jewish refugees admittance into Palestine and forced them to return to the persecution and the war-torn countries they're in. So, and this is a sad time in the American history, in American history, and in European history, and all of the world. So we kind of all turned a blind eye to what was going on, kind of like what's going on now. And I see so many parallels between what was going on during Nazi Germany and what we're seeing now. But there was such a blind eye turned to what was going on in Germany. And so every country denied entry of Jewish people when they were refugees fleeing from the persecution of the Germans, and as they were being sent to concentration camps and death camps. And so that was happening in Jerusalem. That was happening in Palestine. I would assume that the British thought, we don't want any more conflict than we already got there, because they've already had conflicts with the Arabs over the amount of Jews that were there. They actually fought the British several times, the Arabs did, during that period of time. And so I don't know if that was the reasoning why, but they just said, nope, you can't come in. So they shut the borders to the people of Israel, even though they originally said it would be the homeland for the Israelis, for the Jews. And so they shut it off. Every country during that period of time shut their borders to the Jews and said, we don't want you. And so they would be forced to return to Poland or other areas. Actually, that I heard yesterday out of one of these school protests, they were yelling at the Jews, go back to Poland, which is a clear reference to them going back and being exterminated because they were forced to go back to the land they were fleeing, which was just, it made me sick to my stomach to hear that. So anyway, this is what's going on. So now I think, and I want to bring this in here because I think this is really important to talk about the spiritual side of this. During World War II, people, and even today, people do not believe that the Holocaust exists. There are people today who say it never happened. There are people today, even though originally Hamas put out video showing exactly what they did when they threw babies in ovens and turned them on, when they raped women and children, when they killed parents in front of their own children and stuff. They videotaped all this and sent it out because they were proud of what they were doing. And now those videos have been, nobody wants to watch them, and everyone says, oh, no, that never happened. And you think, how in the world can something that's on video, something that we know for a fact happened, how can it be that no one believes that? I was watching the news the other day. These people saying, oh, that never happened. They never raped anybody on October 7th. They never killed babies on October 7th. That's what the Jews are doing. And that's what we got to understand. We live in a world where, and the Bible tells us that Satan is the prince of the air. And what is the airwaves? It's media, it's television, it's our phones. He's in charge of that. He is in control of that. And so he is always going to get us to try to believe the lie as he tries to destroy God's chosen people. And that's what's going on in the time of Hitler. That's what's going on now in the time today, is that you have this situation where people are denying the truth because they have believed the lie. And just like anything, Satan can always get us to believe a lie. Only through the power of Christ can we see through that lie. That's ultimately what we need to do. We need to have a faith in Jesus Christ. After World War II, what ends up happening, Britain, the U.S., all the other nations, France, you name them, they're all horrified about what they allowed happen. They realized what they did wrong. And so it was at that point that Great Britain and everyone else said, hey, let's give the land of Israel back to the Jewish people. And so the United Nations actually voted 33-10 with 13 countries abstaining. So really it was a vote of 33-23 to allow there to be a provisional state of Israel. And it was not long after that, very soon after that, President Truman was the first to recognize it as a true state. And then Israel became a nation almost overnight. And during that period of time, some really crazy things happened. Now, some interesting things that's important to note here is when the UN established this, when the UN said this, they said, we believe that you should have a two-state solution. The two-state solution has been around since the new creation of Israel. And by the way, it's very interesting to know this because it gets mistold all the time. At the time when the UN brought up the idea of the two-state solution, Israel automatically said, we will do that. It was the Arabs It was the Palestinians who said, I'm not going to do that. I'm not going to be a part of a two-state solution. It's Palestine or nothing. And that's been their mindset ever since Israel existed. There is no Israel, only Palestine. And so that's why the wars have continued. Israel has actually, if you go back and if you read, and I hope you will read more than just what I'm saying, but if you go back and you look, you will see that since the beginning of time, Israel has bent over backwards to try to live and coexist with the Palestinians. But there is a desire, a satanic desire, to want to destroy the nation of Israel and not allow it to be. And that's what happens. And wars begin. The minute Israel becomes a nation again, wars start to happen against Israel. In 1947, I already said that, 33-10 with 13 abstaining, so really a 33-23 vote. And this is interesting. In the Middle East, of all the land in the Middle East, 99.9% is controlled by the Arabs. 0.1%. 0.1% of all of the Middle East is controlled by Israel. And that's too much for the Arabs. When it's put in perspective, you realize how sad all this really is. 0.1% of all of the Middle East is controlled by Israel, and that is too much to the Arab. They don't want them in there at all. They were, again, I got ahead of my notes. They were the ones who were for a two-state solution. Palestinians said no. This led to many wars and conflicts, which we're going to be looking at now. So the conflicts for the Promised Land. The first one is the Arab-Israeli War. It started November 6th, I think, is the day that Israel becomes a nation again. On the next day, the wars began. The countries that were involved in that were Egypt, Jordan, Lebanon, and Syria. They all started coming from their lands at Israel to destroy it and to make that land again Palestinian land. Israel wins that war. They lose land in the process, but they win that war. Then during that period of time after that, there's the Palestinian Fadayin insurgency, which happened between the 50s and the 60s. So basically, every year from 1947 until 1960, they're always in war with their Arab neighbors. Then in 1956, we have the Suez Crisis or Sinai War. So what happens during that period of time is Egypt has seized control of the Suez Canal. And now the U.S. and other countries had built some dams and stuff to make the Suez Canal usable. And after all that is done, Egypt seizes it and says, we're in control and we're going to let certain ships through and stuff. Great Britain, France, and Israel attack Egypt to gain control. Israel, basically on its own, really, goes down and takes control of all of the Sinai Peninsula, which I'm going to show you some maps here in a minute. Takes control of all the Sinai Peninsula, including the Gaza Strip and everything, and takes control of the Suez Canal. And they continue to have control after the war, but then the U.S. and the USSR forced Israel to give back land. And so the Gaza Strip, which I'm going to show you here in a second, was given back after the War of 1956. After that war, here's I'll look at the map. So you'll see there the orange is the Arab states. So over here, there's where modern Gaza Strip is now. So this whole area here in the orange was all considered the Gaza Strip, is the whole Gaza Strip. And then the area around Jerusalem and Bethlehem, that was overtaken by Jordan. Because again, during the first war in 1948, Israel was fighting battles on all sides, and they'd just become a nation. They hadn't even really had a time to really build a good army or anything yet. So they were fighting Lebanon to the north, they were fighting Jordan to the east, and they were fighting Egypt to the south, and they lose control of something. So everything that's in orange or tan is Arab controlled. Everything that is in purple is the Jerusalem district, which was supposed to be a no man's control, and then you have the green, which is Israel or Jewish control. So that's what happens after the first war. Then we have the 6-Day War, which comes after the Suez Crisis, the Sinai War, and this was when Israel, by the way, it's when the PLO was founded at this time in 1967, Palestinian Liberation Organization, which becomes a controlling party of the Palestinians for a number of years. But anyway, during the Six-Day War, Israel then is attacked again, and this time they win a considerable victory and gain huge amounts of land that they never had possession of after the first major war between the Arab nations. So here is a map showing all the different armies that were attacking Israel on that. So you have Algeria, you have Libya, you have Sudan, you have Saudi Arabia. You can see the amount of forces, the amount of people that they were sending. And you can't, Israel is so small there, you can't even see it. It's near that brown that you see there. There's a little arrow pointing at Israel. Israel is just a little speck and all of that. But all these nations brought troops and tanks and armies to come and crush Israel. And in 6 days, they defeated all of these armies. And not only did they defeat those armies, but they overtook lands that they didn't have before. And so this shows you the map before the 6-Day War. This is the map afterwards. So over here is the pre-war map, where you got the brown, which controlled by Jordan. Sinai is controlled by Egypt, and you have Lebanon controlling Upper Galilee now. But after that war, Israel takes control of the Golan Heights. And again, there's a lot of complaint about that. Israel needed the Golan Heights because the Golan Heights is a mountain. And when Lebanon was in control of it, they had all their missiles and stuff up there, and they would launch them down at northern Israel. Now Israel controls that. They have defense up there. They needed to have the high spot to protect northern Israel. And so they take the Golan Heights, they take all of the west, what they call the West Bank, the Jerusalem area, the area of Judea, which until this point, the Jews were not even allowed to go into Judea after the War of 1948. They were not allowed to go to where the temple was. They were not allowed to go anywhere near that area. They were blocked out. There was minefields and fences keeping them out of Judea because Jordan had taken control of it. But after the 6-Day War, not only did they gain Jerusalem and Judea, but Samaria. They gained the Golan Heights on the far north. They gained all of the Sinai. They gained all of the Gaza Strip. They gained control all the way to the Suez Canal. So if you look at those Israeli flags there, the Suez Canal is right there by the top of the Mediterranean Sea there. So they controlled all of that, and they gained it. And until this day, they still control it. There are many, many wars that happen after this where Egypt tries to regain the Sinai. They try to regain that, but every time they lose. By the way, since 1948, Israel has never lost a war in all these years. And they've been attacked every single year since 1948, and they've never lost a single ultimate skirmish. Yes, they've had defeats like we had on October 7th, but they've never ultimately lost those battles, those wars. Okay, the Promised Land conflicts. So here we go. We've gone through these. There's the Yom Kippur War. That is in 1973, where Egypt tries to retake Sinai and can't do it. The first Intifada happened between 1987 and 1993. I only included some of the wars. There's Deb's got a list on her phone, and I have it too, but there's a list of ridiculous numbers of war. Basically, every year there's been a war. The first Intifada I put in here because I was actually studying in Israel during this period of time. I saw it firsthand, how the Palestinians, and now we understand it to be the Hamas, were using civilians to try to make Israel look bad. So they would we were driving, it was on a Sunday, because again, Sunday is the first day of the week there. We were driving in a bus to go through Samaria, which is controlled by the Palestinians. We were going to drive through Samaria to an area that we were going to learn that day. And as we're driving through there, it's during one of the lunch breaks or during one of the play times for the school kids. They come out of the building. We have Palestinian vehicle get in front of our bus and slow us down so we could barely move. We had another Palestinian vehicle get behind our bus so we couldn't move. And the kids came out of the school and started picking up rocks and throwing rocks at us. They busted out the front window. I was sitting at the very front of the bus, right up against the window. A rock hit my window and busted it out. Luckily, I did not get hit by it, and I dove to the ground. And we just tried as hard as we could. We were waving Palestinian, the turban things that they wear, trying to say that we were in favor of Palestinians just to try to get out of there and stuff. and the vehicles that had surrounded us would not let us go, and we were pelted for a good 10 minutes while we were trying to get through there. So, but that's the way that they fight. They fight by doing those things, and then what they would do was show the Israeli soldiers firing wax bullets at students, saying, "Look at how the Israelis are attacking children." Well, they didn't tell the whole story. So I know, I was there, I lived it, I know exactly what it was like during this period of time. What we're being told in the U.S. isn't the full truth. And so then during the second intifada, which got even worse, and again, at this point, Hamas is completely taken over. That was when it got so bad that Israel created borders and they put walls up against all the Palestinian areas are now have walls around them, and you can't get out without going through checkpoints and stuff. It's sad because Israel is such a beautiful nation that's now being divided by huge walls and stuff, but it had to be done because they were killing innocent people all the time with attacks, with suicide bombers, and with car bombs and things like that. And so they had to do something to stop that. Now people say, oh, but we haven't been doing anything violent. Well, then, yeah, well, just the other day, these things happen. And so even with these walls, it didn't stop these things because Hamas had gotten very good about digging tunnels and stuff, and that's what they did. They came out of their tunnels on October 7th to attack innocent people in kibbutzes and stuff like this. By the way, the Jews who live in kibbutzes were very passive people. They're not war people or anything like that. And then they came in and killed them and destroyed them. Actually, many of those Jews were actually in favor of a Palestinian nation up until that time when they're attacked by Hamas. All right, so I want to talk just a little quickly about Hamas. It's a political terrorist group. This is what the name is short for. I can't speak Arabic, but you see it there. Interestingly enough, this is what I find so interesting. This is, it was founded in the 80s from the Muslim Brotherhood. The main force behind the first and second intifada that I talked about a few minutes ago. But here's the interesting thing. Hamas is a Hebrew word, which means violence. I don't think it's a coincidence that Hamas chose the name Hamas because they are about violence. They have been trained. By the way, it was ISIS-K that trained Hamas soldiers. The tactics that were used on October 7th were the same tactics that ISIS used in the Middle East when they were attacking British people, American people, and journalists that beheading things like that. They got their training from ISIS-K. And so it's important to understand that. And again, I don't think it's a coincidence. Now, whether it's a satanic thing or not, I don't know. I just don't think it's a coincidence that the Hebrew word for violence is the name that Hamas chose, regardless of if it being an abbreviation for something else. All right, that's all I have. Is there any questions as we close up? I got through that. I tried to get through that as quickly as I could.